Imagine you're looking at the blueprints for this massive, imposing, centuries-old fortress.
Okay, like a classic castle.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
You look at the thick stone walls, the iron gates, the guard towers.
hmm
And your first thought is naturally, well, the people who built this must have been terrified of an attack from the outside.
Sure, it looks like a defensive structure.
Yeah, designed to keep a dangerous enemy at bay.
hmm
But then, you look a little closer at the schematic,
Uh-huh.
and you notice something really strange about the heavy iron locks on the doors.
Which is what?
The locks aren't on the inside, meant to keep invaders out. The locks are actually on the outside.
Oh, wow.
Right. The fortress wasn't built to defend against an external threat at all. It was built to keep the people inside from leaving.
That completely flips the perspective of the observer. You go from seeing this protective shield to seeing a meticulously engineered cage. And the most insidious part of that architectural trick is that if you're standing on the inside looking up at those massive walls, you might actually believe they were built for your own protection.
Exactly. You internalize the architecture as a safety measure rather than, a containment strategy.
Right.
And that shift in perspective, going from assuming a historical structure is this natural, maybe even benevolent defense, to realizing it's a deliberate containment system that is the core mission of our deep dive today.
Yes, and it is a fascinating one.
It really is. We are unpacking this highly detailed, incredibly stylized, and frankly, paradigm-shifting analytical document. It's titled Women.pdf.
I love that title. So simple.
Right. But the text itself, it doesn't bother asking the standard historical question of, what happened to women over the centuries.
No, it goes much deeper.
Yeah, it asks structural questions.
Yeah.
Like, how was the containment system built? And why did the architecture of that system continually change to fit the era?
Which brings us to the central thesis.
Right, which is that prejudice against women is not some static, unchanging, ancient hatred that we're just slowly outgrowing. It's actually a highly adaptable, constantly evolving strategy.
Right, designed to manage power, extract labor, and maintain social stability across totally different economic epochs.
It's crazy to think about it like that.
It is. The author treats history not as this simple timeline of events, but like a forensic crime scene.
Yeah.
They're looking at the evolution of societal structures. But before we get into the actual mechanisms of how this works, we really need to establish some parameters for our discussion today.
Definitely. Just a quick disclaimer for you, our favorite listener.
Right. Because this source material, it touches on massive social movements, deep historical political shifts, and modern organizations.
Everything from global policy groups to very vocal counter-movements.
Exactly. It dissects the architecture of society itself. So our goal today is to impartially report on the structural analysis provided in this text.
We're just mapping the blueprint drawn by the author.
Right. We aren't endorsing any specific political viewpoints, we aren't taking sides on modern culture wars, and we certainly aren't litigating the morality of the past.
Nope. We are strictly analyzing the frameworks and historical patterns exactly as they are presented in the original document.
We're looking at the math behind the social dynamics.
Yeah, the math. And to tease the overarching realization that this text builds toward the concept that completely reorients how you read history. It's this.
Go for it.
The justification for discrimination almost always comes after the control is already in place.
That is the key.
Right. First comes the lock on the outside of the door. Then, decades or maybe centuries later, comes the elaborate story about why the lock is natural or biologically necessary or divinely ordained.
And the material reality is forced into existence first.
Exactly. And the narrative is spun retroactively to cover the tracks.
Which completely turns our standard understanding of historical progression on its head. Because we tend to assume that people in the past, well, they held prejudice beliefs. And those beliefs led them to create oppressive laws.
But the document argues the exact inverse.
Yes. The material needs of the power structure dictated that a certain demographic needed to be controlled.
So the laws were passed to enact that control.
Exactly. And the prejudice beliefs were subsequently manufactured to rationalize those laws.
Okay, let's unpack this, because to understand how that operates in practice, the text insists we have to stop viewing women as a single, static class that was treated the exact same way across all of human history.
Right, that is a fundamental misconception.
Yeah. The author breaks history down into these distinct economic and political eras, basically showing how the societal definition of what a woman is, the version of women permitted to exist, literally shapeshifts.
It updates based on the immediate needs of whatever power structure is prevailing at the time.
So let's look at the timeline the source provides to prove this point, starting with ancient civilizations.
Like Mesopotamia, ancient Greece, the Roman Empire.
Right. The core dynamic the text identifies here is that women are framed primarily as property and lineage vessels.
Yes.
Their legal and social status is entirely tethered to a man, first a father, then a husband. But the text doesn't just, state this as a tragic historical fact.
No, it analyzes the material conditions that made this framing necessary for the men in power.
Right. So what were those conditions?
Well, you have to look at what was happening economically during the shift into agrarian societies.
Okay.
Because prior to the widespread adoption of agriculture and really the whole concept of private property, many hunter-gatherer societies were actually highly egalitarian.
And often matrilineal.
Exactly.
Okay.
Lineage was traced through the mother because, well, biologically speaking, maternity is undeniable.
You definitely know who the mother is.
Right. Paternity, however, is a matter of trust.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So when societies settle down, develop agriculture, and suddenly have the ability to accumulate surplus wealth and land, a new problem emerges.
Which is, how do you pass that wealth down to your legitimate heir?
Bingo. If you are a powerful elite building a dynasty, uncertainty regarding paternity is an absolute existential threat to your legacy.
It messes up the whole transfer of power.
Exactly. The sudden accumulation of wealth requires a mathematically airtight system of inheritance.
Because if a king or a wealthy landowner can't guarantee that the child inheriting his estate is his biological offspring, the entire socioeconomic structure just fractures.
Right. So controlling female reproduction, dictating their sexuality, and severely restricting their physical mobility, it wasn't just a cultural quirk born out of abstract misogyny.
It was functional.
It was the absolute foundational requirement for controlling inheritance and bloodlines.
Like the legal frameworks in ancient Rome.
Yes, exactly. The paterfamilias held the power of life and death over his household.
Wow.
Those were economic mechanisms designed to guarantee the unbroken transfer of property.
So the version of the woman required by the ancient agrarian economy was basically the restricted, heavily guarded vessel.
Correct. But as the text illustrates, when the underlying economic and political structure changes, the societal definition of women updates to serve the new reality.
A shapeshift.
Right. So we move into the medieval period. This encompasses feudal Europe and the early Islamic caliphates.
And the operating system undergoes a massive update here.
Huge update. The core dynamic shifts from women functioning strictly as property to women functioning as highly charged moral symbols.
This is where we see the emergence of these extreme rigid archetypes. The text highlights this stark dichotomy.
Right. A woman is either the pure submissive virgin
Or the self-sacrificing mother.
or the dangerous, corrupting temptress.
Right. And the justification for prejudice moves away from pure economic inheritance, and it cloaks itself in religious doctrine.
Yes. The containment system is no longer just a matter of civil law. It is framed as the divine moral order of the universe.
Why the shift?
Because in the medieval era, religious institutions essentially functioned as the state.
Wow.
Or at the very least, they were the ultimate legitimizing force behind the monarchy.
So the church and the caliphates needed to consolidate social control over these sprawling, largely illiterate, decentralized agrarian populations.
Exactly. And how do you maintain order among millions of peasants?
You make the hierarchy sacred.
Yes. If the king is placed on the throne by God, then the husband is placed at the head of the family by God.
So disobeying the social order isn't just a civil crime anymore. It's a spiritual rebellion.
Right. By framing women's subjugation as a divine mandate, the authorities created a self-policing society.
Because the fear of eternal damnation is a much cheaper and honestly more effective enforcement mechanism than paying for a standing army.
Very cost-effective.
Which sets the stage for what is arguably the most brutal era analyzed in the document.
The early modern period.
Right, roughly the 1500s to the 1700s. And the text focuses heavily on this window because it coincides with the agonizing birth of early nation-states.
The transition out of feudalism.
Yeah, and the peak of the witch hunts in Europe and the Americas. And the source treats the witch hunts not as like an outbreak of mass hysteria, but as a calculated political tool.
It's a really critical data point. The author asks this vital question. Why do witch hunts explode into an epidemic during this specific historical window?
Right, because it wasn't the Dark Ages.
No, this was the era of the Renaissance, the scientific revolution, the printing press.
Yet this is exactly when state-sanctioned torture and execution of women reaches its absolute zenith.
Exactly. And the text argues that this period was characterized by massive, terrifying destabilization.
Like what?
Well, you had the aftermath of plagues decimating populations.
Right.
You had the enclosure of common lands throwing peasants into extreme poverty,
Yeah.
religious wars fracturing communities.
So basically everything is falling apart.
Yes, and emerging centralized governments are trying to strip power away from local villages. Society is effectively collapsing and rebuilding itself.
And the anxiety of the general population must have been at a boiling point?
Oh, absolutely. So the emerging state and religious authorities, they need a way to demonstrate their power. They need to unify a terrified populace and crush any alternative systems of authority.
So they engineer a scapegoat?
Precisely. And the text points out that the primary targets of these hunts were often older, unmarried, or widowed women.
Women who existed outside the direct control of a husband.
Right. Many were local healers or midwives who held significant informal power and trust within their communities.
So by framing these specific women as agents of the devil, blaming them for crop failures or sudden deaths or even just bad weather, the authorities achieved multiple goals simultaneously.
They provided a very simple, tangible explanation for these complex economic and demographic crises ravaging the continent.
And they terrorized the broader female population into absolute submission and reliance on patriarchal protection.
Right. And they allowed the newly forming centralized states to flex their judicial muscle.
Proving to the peasantry that the state was absolutely necessary to protect them from these invisible evils.
Exactly. The version of women's society required here was the existential threat, the ultimate scapegoat, to justify the violent centralization of state power.
Wow. Okay, so once the state is centralized and the population is brought to heel, the world economy shifts again.
Bringing us to the industrial era in the 1800s.
Right. And the text highlights this incredible societal contradiction that emerges here. The invention of the separate spheres ideology.
This one is fascinating.
Yeah, because prior to industrialization, the family was basically a joint economic unit. Men, women, children, they all worked the farm or the family trade together. Their labor was visible and fundamentally integrated.
But industrialization physically separates work from home.
Right.
Factories require massive amounts of cheap, exploitable labor. So working-class women and children are pulled into the brutal public workforce of the textile mills and coal mines.
The capitalist engine absolutely relies on their physical labor to function.
It does. However, the cultural narrative, which is largely dictated by the emerging middle and upper classes, it becomes hyper-fixated on the exact opposite idea.
They invent the concept of the angel in the house.
Yes. They promote the idea that a woman's true biological and moral place is strictly in the private domestic sphere.
Serving as a tranquil refuge for her husband, who is out battling the harsh realities of the public marketplace.
Right. It is cognitive dissonance deployed on a societal scale.
Totally. The system demands the labor of working-class women to run the factories, but it is deeply afraid of the financial independence and social organizing that comes with wage earning.
So it confines them ideologically.
Yeah, the legal and cultural framework insists that women are too delicate, too emotional, and too morally pure for the public sphere, even as millions of women are literally working 14-hour shifts in highly dangerous industrial conditions.
And the brilliance of the separate spheres ideology, as the text notes, is that it provided the perfect justification for paying women a fraction of what men earned.
Right, because if a woman's labor is viewed as merely supplementary to a male breadwinner and her true vocation is domestic, employers have the cultural cover to ruthlessly suppress her wages.
Exactly. The underlying math of the industrial era is just staggering. The system extracts underpaid labor from women in the factories while simultaneously extracting entirely unpaid labor from women in the home.
Because they're tasked with feeding, clothing, and raising the next generation of industrial workers.
Right. The version of the woman required here is the tireless laborer who culturally believes she is actually a fragile domestic angel.
That tension is wild, and it builds until it violently snaps in the early 20th century, particularly around the global crises of World War I and World War II.
The document categorizes this era as the period of temporary equals.
Yeah. When these massive conflicts ignite, the system faces an existential threat to its survival. The men are drafted and sent to the front lines, but the factories still need to build tanks, planes, and ammunition. So what happens to the narrative?
Miraculously, All the biological, moral, and scientific arguments about women being too physically fragile or too emotionally unstable for heavy industry, they simply evaporate overnight.
Just poof, gone.
The state propaganda machines pivot instantly. Women are suddenly depicted as strong, capable, patriotic mechanics, engineers, and pilots.
They enter the workforce en masse.
Right, taking on male roles because the societal structure absolutely requires their participation to avoid annihilation. The narrative adapts instantly to the material need.
But the whiplash is the most revealing part of the analysis. Because the second the crisis ends, the pressure to return to the domestic sphere is overwhelming.
The empowerment was just a temporary lease.
Granted only because it was convenient for the survival of the broader state structure.
Exactly. Once the men return, the post-war economy requires opening up jobs to prevent a massive depression among returning veterans, so the narrative flips right back.
We enter the 1950s. And suddenly, the patriotic duty of a woman is no longer to build bombers. It's to buy appliances, embrace idealized suburban domesticity, and completely vacate the public sphere.
The system needed post-war demographic stability, a baby boom, and a massive surge in consumerism,
And the societal definition of women updated to fulfill those exact economic requirements.
which naturally serves as the pressure cooker for the second-wave feminism of the 1960s, 70s, and 80s.
Right.
The text observes a profound shift here. Women become organized political challengers, directly contesting the legal and cultural frameworks that enforce their secondary status.
They fight for equal pay, reproductive autonomy, legal protections against discrimination.
And the nature of the prejudice changes in response. It moves from overt, legally codified control because the laws are slowly being dismantled to a fierce systemic resistance against actual equality.
The backlash intensifies precisely because the fundamental architecture of male-dominated public and economic life is facing a legitimate structural threat.
Yes. Bringing us to the late 20th and early 21st century, the modern era.
And the source document defines the current dynamic as visible power and persistent scrutiny.
Right. Because on paper, legal equality has largely been achieved in many parts of the world.
Women are in boardrooms, they're heads of state, they're leading academic institutions.
But the text argues that the underlying social, cultural, and economic biases haven't been eradicated. They've simply mutated into more sophisticated forms.
The document describes a modern reality where objectification and the expectations of performative perfection actually intensify as women gain power.
Yes, the power is available, but it must be constantly justified, relentlessly performed according to an impossible set of contradictory standards, and defended daily against a baseline assumption of incompetence.
Synthesizing this entire historical sweep, the core insight of the source is breathtakingly cynical, but logically airtight.
It really is. The text maps it out plainly. If the economic system requires cheap labor, the prevailing narrative dictates women are capable but fundamentally lesser, so pay them less.
If the system requires absolute control for wealth inheritance, the narrative insists women are intellectually fragile and easily corrupted, so they must be legally bound to men.
If the system needs post-war demographic stability, the message is women are biologically destined for domesticity.
And if the system actively fears the rising political power of women, the narrative swiftly shifts to women in power are manipulative, aggressive, and immoral.
Exactly.
I conceptualize it like a societal operating system that is constantly pushing out software updates.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
Right. The hardware, the underlying imperative to control this specific demographic, to extract value and maintain hierarchy that stays exactly the same across the millennia.
But the user interface of the prejudice changes.
Yes, to match the era's specific aesthetic and economic environment. Like in the 1500s, the UI looks like a theological treatise justifying a witch trial.
Right.
In the 1950s, the UI looks like a glossy magazine advertisement for a vacuum cleaner promoting the psychological fulfillment of pristine floors.
Yeah, the happy housewife.
And in the 2020s, the UI looks like a viral internet forum dissecting a female politician's tone of voice, her ambition, or her likability.
The software updates, the vocabulary changes, but the core programming of containment remains entirely intact.
Exactly.
That analogy perfectly captures the mechanism the author is describing. The prejudice is not an arbitrary cultural flaw, it is a highly adaptive strategy.
It behaves like a liquid.
Yes, morphing to fit the exact shape of whatever political or economic container society pours it into.
But this introduces a critical question regarding causality. If the software keeps updating, what actually triggers the deployment of the new code.
Right.
Because the society doesn't just wake up on a random Tuesday, hold a meeting, and decide to completely overhaul its deeply held prejudices. There has to be a catalyst.
Yeah.
What is the real-world spark that initiates these massive narrative shifts?
The author identifies this as the trigger layer. The text argues that a significant intensification or mutation of prejudice rarely materializes out of thin air. It almost invariably follows a measurable material disruption in the real world, a systemic shock.
Like what kind of shock?
This could be a dramatic change in labor availability due to technological advancement. It could be a major demographic shift caused by disease, or a massive societal crisis like a global war, a prolonged famine, or an economic collapse.
And the source actually outlines a specific historical formula for how this plays out. It's practically a mathematical equation for societal backlash.
Yes, the crisis formula. And it operates in 4 distinct phases.
Let's break those down.
Phase 1. A massive systemic disruption occurs. A war, an economic depression, a plague. The normal functioning of society is severely compromised.
All right.
Phase 2. Because the system is facing an existential threat, the traditional rules regarding gender roles are suspended out of sheer necessity. Women gain new roles, unprecedented visibility, and increased autonomy because society simply requires their participation to survive the disruption.
Right, like WWII.
Exactly. Phase 3. The crisis ends. Stability begins to return.
And then?
Phase 4. A severe, coordinated societal backlash occurs. The temporary autonomy is revoked, and immense pressure is applied to force women out of the public sphere and restore the old hierarchical order, often with a new, more rigid set of justifications.
What I found so compelling about the source document's analysis of this 4th phase, the backlash, is how it dissects the deliberate construction of the threat.
What's fascinating here is that when the power structure initiates the backlash to push women back down, it is never framed honestly.
Right. The authorities don't stand up and say, hey, we enjoyed the absolute monopoly on political power and high-paying jobs, and we want it back.
That will be way too transparent and likely invite a rebellion.
Instead, the presence of women in those spaces has to be engineered into a crisis of its own.
The engineering of the narrative is where the system shows its true sophistication. When women attempt to remain in spaces where resources, capital, or political power are redistributed, such as the professional workforce, higher education, or property ownership, their presence is suddenly framed as dangerous.
Unnatural or immoral.
Right. The text points out that the real genius of the containment system is its ability to turn the pursuit of independence into a concept of theft.
That is the exact line from the PDF that stopped me in my tracks. Turn independence into theft, and suddenly oppression looks like fairness.
It is a profound reframing of reality. If a woman campaigning for the right to work, or the right to vote, or the right to control her own finances is framed by the media and the political establishment as taking a job away from a deserving family man,
Or destroying the moral fabric of the community.
or destabilizing the natural order of the universe, then suddenly passing laws to restrict her rights doesn't look like oppression to the general public.
It looks like a rescue mission.
Exactly. It looks like the state protecting the stability of the community. If you can activate the population's fears of moral decay, sexual anxiety, or economic loss, the citizenry will practically beg the authorities to enforce the prejudice.
And this brings us back to the teaser from the beginning, which I consider really the most devastating point in the entire source document, the timeline of retrospective justification.
Right.
The text explicitly states, first comes control, then comes the explanation. As modern people looking back at history, we fall into a trap.
We really do.
We assume that in the 1800s, scientists and philosophers genuinely believed women were biologically inferior, and therefore, lawmakers restricted their access to higher education and the professions based on that prevailing scientific consensus. But the PDF argues that the cause and effect is completely backwards.
Entirely backwards. The material need for control precedes the intellectual justification.
Every time.
A society determines it needs to secure inheritance, or it needs to extract a massive pool of unpaid domestic labor to subsidize industrial growth, or it needs to rapidly stabilize a post-war economy by clearing out the labor market. So the state implements the necessary control mechanisms.
Draconian marriage laws, exclusion from trade guilds, absolute property restrictions.
Yeah, exactly. And then decades, sometimes centuries pass. Then the system generates the scientific, religious, or moral explanations required to rationalize what it has already done.
The reality is shaped by brute legal force,
Mm-hmm.
and then it is explained away as natural or divine.
Yes.
It creates these incredibly frustrating circular, false cause and effect loops. Like a society legally bans women from attending universities, owning businesses, or participating in the scientific community.
Yeah.
Several generations go by. Then the intellectuals of that society look around, point to the distinct lack of female scholars, inventors, or business owners, and present that absence as scientific proof that women are biologically incapable of intellect or leadership. It's like breaking someone's legs, refusing to let them heal, and then writing a comprehensive medical textbook about how their biology makes them naturally unfit to run a marathon.
And because these justifications are essentially fabricated after the fact to fit whatever the current economic or political system needs, they are riddled with massive narrative contradictions.
Whoa, huge contradictions.
The text devotes a significant section to analyzing how historical stereotypes completely conflict with one another, sometimes within the exact same era.
Yeah, women are historically framed as incredibly weak, intellectually deficient, and physically fragile. Yet, simultaneously, they're depicted as dangerous enough to topple empires, corrupt the souls of righteous men, and destroy the moral fabric of society.
Right. They are deemed too simple-minded to understand politics or economics, yet somehow devious enough to mastermind complex, manipulative plots to control powerful men behind the scenes.
They are held up as pure, angelic, self-sacrificing symbols of supreme morality, yet inherently sinful, impure, and fundamentally corrupting.
It's wild.
I struggle with this idea that these contradictions are a feature, not a bug.
How so?
Well, legal systems, which are the primary enforcers of this containment, ostensibly rely on precedent, logic, and internal consistency to maintain their legitimacy. If a society claims women are too frail for the public sphere, but simultaneously punishes working-class women with brutal physical labor in coal mines, that hypocrisy is glaring.
It is.
If the foundational logic of the prejudice is entirely contradictory, weak but dangerous, pure but corrupting, how does a legal and cultural framework sustain itself without collapsing under the weight of its own cognitive dissonance? Doesn't a system require logical consistency to function?
You're approaching it from the perspective that the law exists to uphold philosophical truth. The author argues that the law, in this context, exists to enforce order and preserve hierarchy. The contradictions don't break the system. They are the exact mechanism that grants the system its authoritarian flexibility. A rigid, logically consistent rule set is actually very difficult to apply to an entire population across diverse situations.
That makes sense.
But if your narrative framework is inherently contradictory, it covers all possible exits. It functions as a catch-22. If a woman is quiet, submissive, and stays in the home, she embodies the stereotype of weakness and intellectual inferiority, proving she needs to be controlled by a man. If she is outspoken, ambitious, and steps into the public sphere, she embodies the stereotype of the dangerous, manipulative threat, proving she needs to be aggressively subdued by the state.
So the logical flaw ensures that no matter how a woman behaves, whether she complies or rebels, there is a ready-made, culturally accepted stereotype available to justify her subjugation.
Exactly. The flexibility of the narrative allows for the selective enforcement of power.
That is the insidious brilliance of the narrative layer. It ensures the house always wins. But, as the document points out, a narrative alone isn't enough to physically constrain half the population for millennia.
No, a story, no matter how clever or flexible, doesn't enforce itself.
Right. If this narrative is so perfectly engineered to trap people, how is it actually applied on the ground? It can't just be an idea floating in the ether. It needs infrastructure. It needs muscle.
Which brings us to what the PDF classifies as the system layer.
Okay.
This is where the abstract narrative is forcefully codified into the concrete reality of everyday life. It is the institutionalization of the prejudice. The text examines the legal structures.
Like the historical denial of voting rights.
Yes. And the legal doctrines of coverture that erased a woman's legal identity upon marriage. The inability to sign contracts, open bank accounts, or own property independently.
And then it examines the institutional reinforcement, too.
Right, religious hierarchies defining proper subservient roles from the pulpit, the educational system limiting access to knowledge,
The workplace enforcing rigid wage gaps and professional exclusion.
and the media continuously normalizing these deeply unequal expectations as the cultural baseline.
But institutions are not sentient machines. They are made of people. They are run by individuals making decisions every single day. So the text asks the vital question: who is actually pulling the levers of this machinery? Who makes up the ecosystem of enforcement?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the document breaks down the actors within this ecosystem into four main groups. They all possess entirely different motivations, but their incentives perfectly align to maintain the structure.
Let's hear them.
First, you have the governments and legal authorities, the lawmakers, the judges, the military. Their primary motivation is not necessarily personal malice. It is the maintenance of stable inheritance systems, the preservation of the existing political hierarchy, and the assurance of a predictable, manageable social order.
Second, you have religious authorities.
Yes. Their role is to define the moral order, regulate sexuality, and manage family structures. As the text sharply notes, religion didn't necessarily invent the desire for hierarchy, but it was the most effective tool for making that hierarchy feel sacred, natural, and utterly unchangeable to the masses.
The third group identified in the text is the economic actors. The employers, the guild leaders, the corporate elites, the business owners.
Right, and their motivation is pure, unadulterated math. Maximizing profit.
Right. They benefit immensely from extracting cheap labor from marginalized groups in the public workforce while simultaneously relying on the completely unpaid domestic labor of women to reproduce and maintain that workforce. Preserving dependency structures directly benefits their bottom line.
But it's the analysis of the fourth group that is perhaps the most chilling: ordinary citizens, everyday people. Families, neighbors, communities, both men and women.
Because an authoritarian structure cannot survive solely on the dictates of a king or a CEO.
No. Systems endure because normal, everyday people wake up and perform the rules of the system, enforcing the norms through social conformity, peer pressure, gossip, and the very real threat of social exclusion.
And the text dives deeply into the macro-sociological impact of these ordinary actors by categorizing them into four distinct psychological types.
Right.
Which really shatters the assumption that everyone participating in historical prejudice was like a cartoon villain fueled by pure ideological hatred.
Exactly.
I want to spend some time on these psychological types because understanding the nuance here completely changes how you view historical complicity. The text argues that not everyone enforcing the system is doing it for the same reason, which makes dismantling the system incredibly difficult.
Let's start with the most obvious: the true believer.
Okay.
This is the individual driven by genuine, deeply internalized moral or religious conviction. They honestly believe the narrative. They believe women are intellectually inferior or spiritually dangerous, and that enforcing the patriarchal hierarchy is upholding the natural or divine order of the universe.
In their minds, they are not acting as oppressors. They are acting as righteous defenders of society.
Precisely. But the text argues that true believers are actually in the minority. Yes. The far more common, and perhaps more structurally vital archetype is the opportunist. The opportunist is the economic engine of the prejudice. They don't necessarily care about the divine order or philosophical justifications. They are driven by pragmatism, wealth, and status.
They look at the societal structure, see a system that provides them with free domestic labor, drastically limits their competition in the professional workforce, and grants them automatic, unearned social status simply by virtue of their birth. And they think, this setup heavily benefits me. Why on earth would I question it?
Exactly. The opportunist's compliance is bought and paid for by the material dividends of the system.
And then you have the fearful follower.
Right.
This is the person who might harbor deep doubts about the fairness of the system. They might not even benefit from it materially all that much, but their primary psychological driver is the desire to avoid punishment.
They see what the system does to people who step out of line. The ostracization, the economic ruin, the physical violence.
They don't want to rock the boat. They just crave safety and belonging. So they enforce the rules, keeping their heads down, to avoid the terrifying prospect of becoming a target themselves.
And finally, the closely related performer of norms. These individuals are driven entirely by social status and group cohesion. They enforce societal expectations through shaming, gossiping, and aggressively policing the behavior of their neighbors simply because this is how things have always been done.
Their entire identity and sense of self-worth are intrinsically tied to performing the societal script perfectly and making sure everyone else is reading from the same page.
This analysis leads us into what is arguably the most complex, uncomfortable, and devastating nuance explored in the text: the concept of the internalized participant.
Right.
The PDF does not flinch away from the reality that oppressed groups in this specific context, women frequently become fierce, uncompromising enforcers of the containment system against other women.
It is a profoundly difficult truth to confront, but absolutely vital for understanding how multi-generational systems of control endure.
Right. And the text does not frame this as a moral failing or an inherent flaw of women. It frames it as a brutal, rational survival adaptation under extreme duress.
Oh.
Well, when a societal system completely restricts your access to direct political power, independent economic resources, and physical safety, your strategic options are severely limited.
Yeah.
For many women historically, strictly adhering to the patriarchal rules and ruthlessly policing the behavior of younger or more rebellious women who threatened to break those rules was the only available form of leverage. It is a concept sociologists often refer to as patriarchal bargaining.
So you are trading absolute compliance for a tiny, precarious slice of security and derived status.
Yes.
If you are the older woman in the village, and you have survived a lifetime of suppression by suppressing your own desires and ambitions, seeing a younger woman attempt to claim freedom isn't just a cultural annoyance. It is an existential threat to your worldview.
Because if she can be free, it means your lifelong sacrifice was unnecessary.
Right. Furthermore, if you are the one pointing the finger at the woman who stepped out of line, you prove your unwavering loyalty to the power structure. You demonstrate your usefulness. And hopefully that means the system will protect you, or at least it won't crush you today.
Precisely. The text summarizes it with a haunting clarity. Oppressed groups can become enforcers of the system, not because they benefit equally from its design, but because they adapt to survive within its constraints.
If you are structurally barred from being the king, the next best survival strategy is to become the king's most loyal, vigilant guard against the other peasants.
It fractures solidarity and ensures the oppressed police themselves.
You know, the source document actually pauses its analysis right here to ask the reader a pointed theoretical question, and I want to pose it directly to you, the listener. Think about the massive ecosystem of actors we just mapped out. When you look at this structure, which psychological type do you think is actually the most dangerous to the long-term project of equality? Is it the true believer, the zealot who genuinely thinks the hierarchy is ordained by God and cannot be reasoned with? Or is it the opportunist, the vast, silent middle class who doesn't believe a word of the ideology but continuously enforces it anyway, simply because they enjoy the lack of professional competition and the free domestic labor?
It is a terrifying question to ponder.
It really is.
Because the true believer provides the moral fanaticism that will never willingly surrender. But the opportunist provides the sheer numbers and the economic viability that allows the system to function day in and day out. Together, they create an interlocking, mutually reinforcing mechanism of control.
So we can clearly see how the actors benefit materially. The free labor, the guaranteed inheritance, the reduction of competition. But what is the deep psychological payoff? What makes even ordinary, relatively powerless people comfortable with maintaining such a rigid, oppressive hierarchy?
Good question.
Because laws and economics aren't enough to keep a system running for centuries. People have to actually want it on some psychological level.
That transitions us into the psychological layer of the document. The text argues that sexist systems persist not just through the threat of brute force, but through comfort, habit, and a deep fundamental human desire for certainty.
Right.
The world is inherently complex, chaotic, and terrifying. It is constantly changing, controlling women, taking half the human population and forcing them into a highly predictable, easily monitored, legally defined box radically simplifies that complexity.
It drastically reduces the variables in a chaotic universe.
Precisely. If everyone has a fixed, biological, unchangeable place in the hierarchy, the world makes sense.
And the text points out a profound historical irony here. The deepest fear driving patriarchal structures wasn't actually the belief that women were physically weak or utterly incompetent.
No. The deepest, most visceral fear was that women were fundamentally uncontrollable.
Historically, women held immense, unquantifiable, indirect power.
Yes. They controlled the actual mechanisms of reproduction. They influenced sexuality. They held massive emotional, social, and logistical sway within the complex networks of extended families and communities.
And to a male-dominated, state-level system that relies entirely on rigid predictability, clear chains of command, and measurable authority, that kind of fluid, indirect, relational power is terrifying.
It cannot be easily tracked on a ledger or controlled by a decree.
Therefore, The system has to neutralize that indirect power by bringing it under direct, formal management. And the text details several specific psychological mechanisms engineered to achieve this neutralization. One of the most fascinating is the concept of benevolent sexism and the deployment of the pedestal mechanism.
This is a crucial distinction. We often assume prejudice only looks like overt hostility or violence.
Right.
But benevolent sexism operates differently. It frames women as precious, morally pure, spiritually elevated, and desperately in need of male protection from the harsh realities of the world.
It places them on a metaphorical pedestal, treating them as a muse, the idealized mother of the nation, or a fragile angelic figure.
But the text sharply observes the physics of a pedestal. Putting someone on a pedestal is just a prettier, more socially acceptable way of fixing them entirely in place.
Right. A pedestal is an incredibly small, isolated space. You cannot move around on it, you cannot run, you cannot fight.
It elevates you symbolically in the realm of ideals while entirely denying you real, practical agency and political power in the material world.
And the trap is perfectly sprung, because the moment you step off that pedestal, the moment you express ambition, demand a bank account, or express anger, the benevolent sexism instantly evaporates and reveals the hostile sexism underneath.
Yes. You go from being too pure and delicate for this harsh world to being a dangerous, aggressive, manipulative threat in the blink of an eye.
The pedestal isn't a throne. It's a beautifully decorated guard tower.
The author also highlights another psychological safety valve for the system, the concept of the exception woman.
Oh, this is so relevant.
Because no system is perfect. And occasionally, a woman's talent, wealth, or sheer force of will allows her to break through the containment structure and achieve massive success. A powerful queen, a brilliant female CEO, a renowned scientist.
And the system could view this as proof that its foundational logic about female inferiority is flawed, which would threaten the entire architecture.
Right. But instead, the system neatly absorbs this contradiction by framing her strictly as not like other women.
She's an exception to the rule. She possesses a masculine mind.
Exactly. And by isolating her as an anomaly, the system achieves two goals. First, it gets to pat itself on the back for being a meritocracy, pointing to her success as proof that true talent will always rise.
And second, and more importantly, by defining her as an exception, it completely preserves the exclusionary rule for the other 99% of women.
The exception proves the rule, protecting the broader containment system from a full structural challenge. It is tokenism utilized as a pressure release valve.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because a major section of this PDF takes a sledgehammer to a list of deeply entrenched historical misconceptions. These are the exact arguments and rationalizations you still hear repeated in modern debates, and the text systematically dismantles them.
Right.
Let's look at the first myth. The idea that historically women chose traditional roles, they preferred domesticity, and therefore the historical inequality was a natural, voluntary arrangement rather than an oppressive system.
The reality, as the text painstakingly points out through economic data, is that a constrained choice is not a free choice. It is a form of coercion.
Say more about that.
If a society engineers a reality where your options are, option A, marry, surrender your legal identity, and become entirely economically dependent on a husband. Or option B, remain unmarried and face absolute poverty, severe social ostracization, exclusion from all lucrative professions, and extreme legal vulnerability.
Yeah.
Choosing marriage isn't a demonstration of a natural biological preference for domesticity. It is a desperate survival calculation made under extreme duress.
To look back at the outcome of a heavily rigged socioeconomic system and point to it as proof that the victims inherently preferred their subjugation is a massive, intellectually dishonest logical fallacy.
It really is. The second major myth the text attacks is the biological determinism argument.
The pervasive idea that the vast differences in societal roles, wealth, and power are purely the result of biology, that men are naturally evolved to be rational, aggressive leaders, and women are naturally evolved to be emotional, passive caretakers.
And the text handles the biology question brilliantly, refusing to fall into the trap of denying biological reality, but completely reframing its impact.
How so?
It acknowledges that biological differences exist between the sexes, but it establishes a firm rule. Biology sets the possibilities. Systems decide the outcomes.
I love that.
The system is what assigns value to biological traits. The text uses emotional expression as a prime example. The biological capacity to feel and express emotion is a human trait. But the way emotional expression is rewarded or punished in the public sphere is entirely socially conditioned.
Right. A male political leader pounding his fist on a podium and expressing intense anger is viewed by the system as passionate, strong, and authoritative.
But a female political leader expressing the exact same level of anger is viewed by the system as unstable, hysterical, and overly emotional.
The biological mechanism of emotion is identical. It is the systemic prejudice interpretation that creates the disparate outcome.
Exactly.
Another critical point the text addresses, which feels incredibly relevant to how we consume media today, is the myth surrounding extreme rhetoric.
Yes.
When you analyze feminist movements, or really any historical movement fighting for civil equality, there are invariably going to be extreme voices, radical factions, or fringe rhetoric. Opponents of equality continually point to those extremes as definitive proof that the entire movement is inherently dangerous, unhinged, and must be stopped.
The text provides a vital systemic corrective to this dynamic.
Yeah.
It points out that extreme or radicalized rhetoric within a marginalized group is almost always a symptom of prolonged systemic pressure. When a demographic faces decades of institutional constraints, constant invalidation, and a total lack of access to traditional levers of power, frustration mounts. Rhetoric inevitably becomes radicalized because polite requests for equality have failed.
Right.
But the crucial mechanism the author identifies is what the opposing power structure does with that fringe rhetoric. The establishment takes those extreme voices, intentionally amplifies them through media channels, presents them to the public as the absolute, unified norm for the entire marginalized group.
And then uses that manufactured, exaggerated threat to justify maintaining the prejudice and launching a harsh backlash.
The extremes become the narrative ammunition perfectly designed to fuel the cyclical backlash loop we discussed earlier. It is a self-fulfilling prophecy of control.
Which brings us to the final and perhaps most challenging section of the document. The legacy layer. Because as you're listening to this deep dive, you might be thinking, okay, this is a fascinating historical analysis. But we've changed the laws. We have the Equal Pay Act, we have Title IX protecting education. Women can own property and open bank accounts. Hasn't this containment system been dismantled?
And the PDF answers with a resounding, undeniable no.
The underlying system didn't simply pack up and disappear when the laws changed. It just left behind a massive, pervasive amount of what the author calls residue.
Structural and psychological residue. Even with legal equality codified on paper, the foundational architecture of the old fortress is still largely standing, and we are still living inside its walls.
We still see persistent, mathematically verifiable wage gaps.
We see a vastly disproportionate burden of unpaid domestic and caregiving labor continuing to fall squarely on women, functioning as an invisible tax on their time and energy.
And perhaps most deeply, we were dealing with entrenched psychological perception biases about what authority, competence, and leadership are fundamentally supposed to look and sound like.
Because the baseline template for a leader in our cultural subconscious was forged during centuries of absolute male rule.
And the text outlines a modern phenomenon it calls the visibility trap. Because the explicit modern narrative, the new UI of the software is, women are completely equal, you can do anything, you can have it all.
Women in power are actively, loudly encouraged to succeed and break glass ceilings.
But the trap is that once they become highly visible in those spaces of power, they are expected to perform their roles with absolute, flawless perfection.
They are subjected to an entirely different matrix of scrutiny, and they are judged exponentially more harshly for any failure, misstep, or display of normal human fallibility compared to their male counterparts who are allowed to be average.
The systemic paradox hasn't disappeared. It has merely evolved to survive in a legally egalitarian environment. Women are now permitted to be visible and hold tremendous influence, but they remain deeply constrained by the exhausting, contradictory expectations of how they must perform that power in order to remain acceptable to the legacy structure.
To ground this analysis in the absolute presence, the source document meticulously maps out how modern organizations and movements are interacting with this legacy system today.
And again, to our listener, we are looking at this neutrally, just mapping the terrain of the current battlefield as the author presents it.
Right. The text categorizes these groups based on which specific layer of the historical system they are strategically attempting to dismantle or modify. It's a fascinating strategic breakdown.
Like, for instance, you have global policy groups like UN Women.
Right. They are operating at the highest macro-institutional level, attempting to shift global legal standards and international norms, essentially trying to rewrite the overarching blueprints of the system.
Then you have legal and rights-based organizations like the ACLU or the National Women's Law Center. They are attacking the systemic layer directly through the courts, fighting the residue of discriminatory laws and setting new legal precedents.
Then you look at groups like Lean In, which focus almost entirely on the economic and professional layer.
Right. Their strategy is to help women navigate the structural inequality of opportunity within corporate environments, essentially trying to hack the economic layer from the inside by teaching women how to negotiate within the existing power structure.
On a different front, you have massive cultural movements like Me Too. Their strategy directly targets the narrative layer.
By exposing hidden behaviors and destroying the silence that protected abusers, they're attempting to force a rapid shift in cultural norms, social consequences, and the psychology of what society is willing to tolerate.
And finally, you have grassroots organizations focusing heavily on intersectionality, operating on the crucial recognition that this historical prejudice doesn't exist in a vacuum. It fractures and intensifies differently across intersecting lines of race, economic class, and geographic location.
And crucially, for a complete, objective, systemic view, the text fully acknowledges the robust existence of modern countermovements.
Yes. Organizations, political factions, and cultural commentators that criticize feminist policies, emphasize the erosion of men's issues, or actively push back against the rapid shifts in traditional gender roles.
The author notes that every structural movement inevitably generates a systemic response. The intense polarization and fierce debates we see today are absolute proof that the fundamental architecture of the system and the operating system itself is still being actively contested.
The fortress is currently a chaotic, simultaneous construction and demolition site.
It is an active, daily battlefield over the core programming of society. And when I think about how an individual woman has to navigate this modern residue day in and day out, I keep coming back to the double standard mechanism the text describes.
Right.
It operates exactly like being put in the driver's seat of a high-performing sports car.
Yeah.
Society, the media, the corporate world, they all tell you, drive as fast as possible, break the glass ceiling, be a boss, lean in.
Right.
But the absolute moment you actually touch the gas pedal, you are pulled over and handed a speeding ticket.
Wow.
The instructions are completely schizophrenic. You're told to be supremely confident, but never, ever be aggressive. Be physically attractive, but don't be distracting to your male colleagues. Be an incredibly devoted mother, but absolutely do not let it affect your relentless dedication to your career.
It is a constantly moving target, meticulously engineered by the legacy system to ensure you never, ever quite hit the bullseye. You are set up by the very design of the expectations to be perpetually slightly wrong.
It is exhausting by design, and that exhaustion serves a structural purpose.
Exactly, because if an individual is forced to constantly expend massive amounts of cognitive and emotional energy merely trying to perfectly balance on the tightrope of these contradictory expectations, they have significantly less energy, time, and resources available to actually step back and dismantle the circus tent.
The performance of navigating the system becomes so demanding that it prevents the dismantling of the system.
That's it, exactly.
So what does this all mean? After tracing this immense timeline from the agrarian fields of ancient Babylon to the corporate boardrooms of the modern era, after dissecting the triggers, the engineered narratives, the complex ecosystem of actors, and the deep psychological payoffs, how do we ultimately synthesize this journey? What is the core takeaway of women.pdf?
The ultimate synthesis is a profound paradigm shift. Prejudice against women is not, and never has been, a single isolated act of irrational hatred. It is a highly rational, hyper-adaptable, multi-layered ecosystem.
It was deliberately designed over millennia to manage political power, control economic resources, mitigate societal uncertainty, and enforce a predictable stability for those at the top.
And its greatest, most successful trick was disguising its brutal structural engineering as divine morality, biological inevitability, and mere common sense. The text proves that power structures do not require perfect, philosophically sound, or logically consistent justifications.
Right.
They merely require believable stories that make the control feel natural to the people living inside the fortress.
Right.
And to you, listening to this deep dive, absorbing this framework provides you with what I can only describe as a matrix-level view of the world around you. Once you see the code, you cannot unsee it.
Exactly.
Moving forward, whenever you are watching the evening news or scrolling through your feed and you witness a sudden societal backlash, a legislative crackdown, or a manufactured moral panic regarding gender roles or women's autonomy, you don't have to just react emotionally to the noise anymore. You can step back, look at the architecture, and ask the surgical structural questions. What material or economic disruption just occurred? Who is losing their stability or status, and whose foundational power is this new narrative desperately trying to protect?
It elevates you from being a passive consumer of societal narratives to an active, critical analyst of power structures. You stop looking at the heavy iron locks on the doors and blindly assuming they were installed for your protection, and you start looking closely at who is currently holding the key.
That is a powerful shift.
I want to leave you with one final, deeply provocative thought to mull over. Something that builds on everything we've unpacked today, but looks directly into the immediate future. We've established that historical prejudice was a technology built by human systems requiring control and predictability, and it left behind a massive ocean of structural and psychological residue in our data, our laws, and our behaviors. So what happens right now, at this exact moment in history, as we frantically build and deploy artificial intelligence?
It is perhaps the most critical question of our era.
We are actively training algorithmic machine learning and large language models on the entirety of human history. We are feeding these systems the texts, the literature, the economic outcomes, and the heavily biased data of a global structure that spent thousands of years deliberately constraining women and rationalizing that constraint.
Right.
Are we, right now, unknowingly hard-coding the retrospective justifications of the past into the predictive algorithms of the future? Could the next version of this prejudice, the ultimate software update, be an entirely invisible algorithmic one?
A digital system that enforces the historical double standards, the wage biases, and the visibility traps so seamlessly, so mathematically, that it doesn't even need human actors. No true believers, no opportunists to enforce the cage anymore.
Yeah.
If an AI system stands human history and learns that women historically occupy vastly less space in positions of leadership, wealth accumulation, or historical significance, it lacks the context to understand why.
It might simply predict and mathematically enforce that disparate outcome in its future decisions, whether it's sorting resumes or approving loans, viewing the historical constraint not as an injustice, but as the natural baseline reality of the human data set.
At that point, the fortress walls transition from stone to legal code to digital algorithms, and they become completely invisible.
It is a reality we all need to be hyper-aware of as we collectively write the code for the next era of human society. Because history has shown us, time and time again, that the locks are very rarely designed to keep the danger out. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep looking closely at the blueprints. Keep aggressively questioning the narratives constructed around you. And never ever assume the structure you were born into is simply the way things are. We'll catch you next time.